Morning, I'm Dr. Reyes. Today we'll be talking about surgery in critically ill patients, particularly trauma patients. So our topics would include the following, and our source would still be Shorts, Principles of Surgery 11th edition, and the Surviving Sepsis Guidelines. Okay. So the recognition of the bloody vicious cycle and introduction of damage control surgery have improved the survival of critically injured patients. Because before, when the when the damage control surgery has not yet been introduced, what the surgeons uh, tended to do, even if the patient is severely hypotensive, uh, they tended to fix everything all at once, all at one setting. So, for example, you had a patient who had multiple stab wounds. There was an injury to the stomach, an injury to the pancreas, an injury to the spleen, an injury to the colon. Even if the patient arrived 50 palpatory, they would continue with all of the repairs, and then the patient eventually succumbed. Why? Because there's such a thing as this bloody vicious cycle, also known as the triad of death. So it consists of the following. It consists of metabolic acidosis, hypothermia, and coagulopathy, which are actually all interrelated. So the bloody vicious cycle was first described in 1981, and it is the lethal combination of all those three. For example, you had an exsanguinating patient. So that patient already has metabolic acidosis. That would produce decreased myocardial performance and in turn produce hypothermia. And that hypothermia would later on lead to coagulopathy because of the halt in the coagulation cascade. And that coagulopathy will eventually lead to lactic acidosis, which in turn would produce more acidosis in our patients. So, um, if you can see, if you have a patient severely injured in a trauma, um, what would happen? There would be immunoactivation, blood loss, and tissue injury, all leading to progressive systemic coagulopathy. And the massive transfusion and pre existing diseases would further contribute to that. So why do we get hypothermia? It's because of evaporative and conductive heat loss and diminished heat production. Even if you give warming blankets and blood warmers, usually that would not help. The only thing that would help your patient would be proper transfusion of the right blood components. The metabolic acidosis of shock is exacerbated usually by uh, aortic clamping and administration of pressors, massive transfusion of RBCs, and impaired myocardial performance. So the acute coagulopathy of trauma is also compounded by hemodilution, hypothermia, and acidosis. So once the cycle starts, each of the components magnifies each other, as I earlier pointed out. So what is the purpose of damage control surgery? It is to limit the operative time so that the patient can be returned to the surgical ICU for physiological restoration, and the cycle thereby is broken. So basically, if your patient, for example, again, multiple stab wounds, uh, they have different organs involved. So you have an injury to the liver, to the lungs, to the spleen, to the small and large intestine. He comes to you at the ER, let's say 50 palpatory. So he is already paper white. So you know that this patient has already lost massive amounts of blood. Um, Usually, if you see those kinds of patients, the first thing that will come to your mind as a surgeon would be that you would perform the minimum uh, type of surgery possible for the patient to survive. And then the concept is you bring your patient to the OR immediately, take care of the immediate injury, life threatening injuries, and then bring them to the surgical ICU to be able to hydrate, to transfuse. And then once your patient is already physiologically replete, you bring back your patient to the operating room to do the definitive surgery. Okay. So when do you think of damage control surgery? Usually, if your patient has refractory hypothermia, if your patient has profound acidosis, or refractory coagulopathy. Okay. So the goal of damage control is to control surgical bleeding and limit the GI spillage, especially of coming from the large intestine, fecal material coming from the large intestine. So this operative technique used in these kinds of surgery are all temporary measures, which need further definitive procedures at a later time. So, for example, in this patient, you have aortic injury. So, what you do is you repair it with the PTFE interposition graft, if possible. However, if not, you could just use a stent to temporize the patient. For example, again, if you have an iliac injury, so your external iliacs have been transected, what you could do is just put a shunt, just tie the ends, and then uh, get out, go to the surgical ICU, and then correct all of the physiologic parameters of your patient. Then once it is corrected, you go back to definitive surgery. So the definitive surgery would be the transposition or the PTFE graft ready. So they say that celiac injuries may be ligated. However, if you do that, although uh, it is possible, however, there will be physiological consequences. So if the entire celiac is uh, destroyed, if you can see all of the blood supply to the stomach would probably be destroyed also. So the left gastric, the right gastric, and the short gastrics would all be compromised. Therefore, if you ligate it, eventually the stomach will die. Okay, but that is possible because we are talking of damage control. The point is we have to save the life of the patient first. Um, the superior mesenteric artery must always maintain flow because this one we cannot compromise. We cannot just ligate it. We should at least make a shunt in order for the uh, large portion of the small bowels to still be viable. Arterial reconstruction following shunt placement should be done optimally within 6 hours. So if you remember the injury to the iliac vessels and you placed a shunt, you should go back to correct it as soon as possible, hopefully within 6 hours, so that there will be no complications like thrombosis on the affected organs. So, as a rule, venous injuries can be ligated, except for the popliteal vein and the suprarenal inferior vena cava. So, again, although it is possible, excuse me, to perform ligation of the infrarenal inferior vena cava. You should you should also note that in these patients, there's a physiologic consequence for ligation of the uh, vena cava. So one of the consequence is possible bilateral edema of the lower extremities, which may later need fasciotomy just to decompress that area. Sorry. So for extensive solid organ injuries to the spleen or the kidney, what we do is we resect that portion or excise that portion already because that would save on the time rather than repairing it. For hepatic injuries naman, we usually could just do perihepatic packing of the liver, which would most of the time stop the bleeding. For translobar gunshot wounds naman, uh, we use this silastic catheter and Penrose drain. We tie it on both ends, as seen here, and then we inflate it, and it's supposed to do tamponade on those areas. So if you have deep lacerations of the liver, you can get a simple Foley catheter and then inflate the balloon, and then that would produce tamponade already on that area. Can you just give me 5 minutes? I have to do something. Sorry. Okay, sorry. Um, Anyone here who doesn't understand Tagalog, by the way? Wala naman. Okay, sige, sige. Good. So far, do you understand the concept of damage control surgery? So basically, baka kasi medyo nalilito tayo, no? Sabihin, bakit pwede palang itali-itali lang yung mga kung ano-anong injuries? No, the concept is, gusto natin yung fastest surgery possible for the patient kasi nga hypotensive na sila. So because of this hypotension, nagkaroon ng triad of death. So coagulopathy, hypothermia, and metabolic acidosis. So once that sets in kasi, uh, vicious cycle siya eh. So statistically, yung chances ng patients nyo mas pumapangit. So if you perform definitive surgery on those patients, let's say nag-resect anastomose ka ng kung ano-ano, most likely yung anastomosis mo would fail because kulang yung kailangan ng katawan natin to repair all of those things. Tapos, what else? For example, kunwari ito, you have a bleeding peripheral, sorry. So, for example, you have a bleeding peripheral pulmonary injury. Instead of trying to repair it, dahil nasa periphery siya, you just use a stapler. This appliance over here is called a stapler, and you resect that portion already, because that would be the fastest for the patient. Although the best thing would still normally be suturing, pero in these cases, kasi nga nagmamadali ka, it's better to just resect that portion with a stapler. So if you have a penetrating injury naman, which goes deeper, kanina peripheral no? So this time, a penetrating injury, what you do is open up the tract. It's called tractotomy. So when you open up the tract, of course, you will see individual vessels and bronchi. You should ligate each of those vessels and each of those bronchi, and then just leave it open. Okay? Example naman, for the heart, if you have a cardiac injury, um, they may be temporarily controlled using either a running suture or even skin staplers. Skin staplers will be the fastest. However, yung skin staples, you cannot do that for the thin right ventricle. So what you do is you put pledgets and then you repair it using that pledgeted repair para hindi magka-cut through yung mga sutures. So the second key component of damage control is limiting enteric contents. So before the patient is returned to the surgical ICU, the abdomen must also be closed temporarily. So the temporary closure is like this, like that. So in this temporary closure, the bowel is covered with a fenestrated subfascial sterile drape. In the Philippines, what we use is the Bogota bag, or for the medical technologists, probably you're familiar with the blood bag. We sew that together and then we put it as a covering, um, so that your patient will not have what do you call this, abdominal compartment syndrome afterwards. So um, you can just imagine a patient who has lost 2 to 3 liters of blood, and you replace all of that with crystalloids. What will happen? There will be bowel edema on these patients. And since the bowel is very edematous, you cannot close the abdomen. So what you do is just to put a cover on that, uh, sew it on the sides of the abdomen, and then bring your patient back to the surgical ICU. So enteric contents naman, For example, like in this patient, you can stapler it, or you can simply tie both ends to close it. For injuries of the pancreas naman, regardless of location, you should just pack it and check for the integrity of the pancreatic ducts on the reoperation. Okay, so during the initial damage control surgery, the subfascial sterile drapes is usually not covered by a blue towel. This is in order to be able to see the inside of the abdomen and return to the OR within 24 hours as planned once the patient clinically improves. So, how do we know that the patient has clinically improved? The patient must have a normal body temperature already. There must be normal coagulation test and excuse me, and correction of acidosis. So, after the surgery, you have the acute resuscitation phase, which is the first 12 to 24 hours. So the key principles include, again, optimizing tissue perfusion, ensure normothermia, restore coagulation status, and this is where you do the initial volume loading to attain adequate preload. So if you are not able to attain the adequate preload, you could do vasopressors and inotropic agents. So the optimal hemoglobin levels in this patient would be a target of more than 10 grams per deciliter. However, after the 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 initial resuscitation, we lower our transfusion trigger to less than 7 grams per deciliter to limit the adverse inflammatory effects of stored RBCs. So when we are hydrating our patients, we also do monitoring on them. Kasi hindi naman pwedeng sabay-sabay bibigay mo yung fluids mo, which would result in uh, problems later on. So we have invasive monitoring techniques. The gold standard is the pulmonary artery catheterization. However, it's very invasive, as I will show you in this next in this video. Okay, so the first step is to uh, perform the ultrasound on the neck. And if you can see here, the internal jugular vein is identified. And then we put a local anesthetic. Okay, so that's the local anesthetic being injected. And then you get the uh, needle, which is supposed to puncture that internal jugular here. So once you have confirmed that is the internal jugular vein, you get a guide wire, insert it, going to the superior vena cava, then remove the initial needle and replace it with a bigger port. Okay. And then from that port, that is where you will insert your uh, internal jugular port, the pulmonary artery catheter. So that is the pulmonary artery catheter being inserted. And if you can see, this is inserted going to the pulmonary artery. So that is very invasive. Some of these patients, they have a rupture of the pulmonary artery when the balloon is inflated. Some have problems when it passes through the sinoatrial node. So they have tried to look at more minimally invasive techniques for these patients. So the most common and most reliable are the transpulmonary thermodilution, Doppler ultrasound, and the pulse control analysis. So optimal early resuscitation is mandatory and determines when the patient can undergo additional necessary imaging and return to the OR after initial damage control, because you do not bring a severely hypotensive patient to the CT scan, to the MRI, or even to the X-ray, because the patient might undergo cardiopulmonary arrest while you are performing the imaging technique. So again, specific goals of resuscitation would include the core temperature of more than 35, base deficit of less than 6, and normal coagulation indices. The adverse sequela of excessive crystalloid resuscitation all are all because of edema. So increased ICP is because of edema of the brain, worsening pulmonary edema, worsening intra-abdominal is because of the uh, increase in size of the intra-abdominal visceral components because of edema also. Therefore, it should be the overall trend of the resuscitation rather than the rapid reduction of the base deficit that is the goal. What this means is that you try to slowly correct the all of the um, deficits of your patient rather than trying to correct them all in one hour. So the goal is to normalize lactate within 24 hours. Trauma wounds should be examined daily so that you will see if there's progression of healing or signs of infection. So these are at least three of the types of complex soft tissue wounds of the abdomen that are difficult to manage. So Morel-Lavalley lesions, shotgun wounds, and other destructive blast injuries. Yung first picture is the Morel-Lavalley lesions, which is a degloving injury after blunt abdominal trauma. It is degloving because the subcutaneous tissues are separated from the abdominal wall or the fascia. So for trauma wound care, the initial step is to remove all the devitalized tissue by debridement. And sometimes it takes more than one surgery. So the most common is the wet to dry dressing. So this is a very simplified instruction on how to do wet to dry dressings. In this example, she just used an apple, and that apple has an abdominal wound. So what you do with wet to dry dressing is you get a gauze and you moisten the tip of that gauze, usually with sterile water. And then that moistened portion goes inside and you just pack it in. And then the dry portion would be uh, on on the outside. So it's called wet to dry dressing. Okay. There's a better way, especially for bigger wounds which require closure, which is the VAC device. It's a vacuum assisted closure device. Okay. So for example, this is a bigger wound. You get the special foam and measure it to fit that wound. You don't have to pack it, just put it inside, even a little loosely. Get uh, a covering for that, usually a transparent cover. It's a special kind of dressing. And then you make a hole so that the foam will be exposed. And then after that, you will uh, place your suction apparatus over the hole so that when you activate it, there will be a vacuum and all of the uh, exudates or fluids will come out, thereby promoting good wound healing and preventing infections. Okay. So after surgeries, you must always inspect your wounds. So if you have a midline laparotomy wound, inspect it after 48 hours because sometimes you will be surprised when you open it up, it's already infected, similar to the picture on the right. So if you have an ileostomy or colostomy, this is the uh, small or large bowel which is exteriorated. So the picture on the left shows you the ideal appearance of the ileostomy or colostomy, while those pictures on the right show you necrosis and infection. So if your patient has high-grade fever, you should inspect the wound sooner to exclude an early necrotizing infection. So if you have an infection, usually heralded by redness, pain, and virulent discharge, you should open that wound. So remember kanina yung wet to dry dressing natin, ganun yung gagawin to that open wound. You do not suture it back. So you first palpate if the midline fascia is intact, and then if it is intact, just put your wet to dry dressing. So most common intra-abdominal complications would include anastomotic failure and abscesses. So the choice of treatment would depend on the location and the extent of the collection. So if you have a localized infection, which is amenable to percutaneous drainage, that would be the best for the patient. But if it is generalized, you have no choice but to re-explore the patient. Anastomotic failures usually require uh, reoperative surgery. Okay. So when it comes to intra-abdominal pressure, there's such a term as intra-abdominal hypertension and abdominal compartment syndrome. So if you recall kanina, no, yung bowels were very edematous kaya hindi maisara. If ever maisara mo yon, what would happen to the patient would be there would be increased intra-abdominal pressure, most likely would lead to abdominal compartment syndrome. So intra-abdominal hypertension is defined as an IAP more than 12, more than 12 or equal to 12 on 3 standard measurements conducted 4 to 6 hours apart. So our normal intra-abdominal pressure is 5 to 7 only. So higher pressures in the absence of organ dysfunction will give you the corresponding grades. Grade 1 for 12 to 15, grade 2, 16 to 20, grade 3, 21 to 25, and grade 4, more than 25. Uh, if you have new onset organ dysfunction and your intra-abdominal pressure is more than 20, that is already considered ACS. So intra-abdominal hypertension sufficient to produce physiologic deterioration is called abdominal compartment syndrome. Usually you see decreased urine output, increased pulmonary inspiratory pressures, decreased cardiac preload, and decreased cardiac output. So You could classify it as primary or secondary. Primary meaning you have intra-abdominal injuries, and secondary is because of splanchnic reperfusion after massive resuscitation. For example, you have a patient with uh, amputation injury to both lower extremities, and it resulted to massive blood loss, about 3 liters. And then you try to hydrate your patient to get the uh, normal mean arterial pressure at least. And the problem is the infusion was very rapid. So that patient will have splanchnic reperfusion, which would lead to edema, and that edema would cause the secondary abdominal compartment syndrome. So how do we measure the intra-abdominal pressures? Usually, transurethral bladder pressure is what we perform. So it is the same as the intra-abdominal pressure most of the time. So how do we do it? We insert a Foley catheter in our patient. We instill fluid. We connect the tube to a transducer, and then you measure the bladder pressure in the supine position at end expiration. So when is the uh, transurethral bladder pressure not reliable? For patients with bladder rupture, if there is external compression from pelvic packing, for neurogenic bladders and adhesive diseases. Um, so if you can see here, this is the vicious cycle for abdominal compartment syndrome. So your patient has aggressive volume resuscitation. So again, that produced edema of the bowels. You have elevated intra-abdominal pressure due to bowel edema, and then your vena cava is compressed. So why do you think the vena cava is the one that's being compressed? It is because the vena cava compared to the aorta is muscular. So the vena cava is more susceptible to compression. So if you have your aorta opened and then your vena cava is compressed, what will happen? The blood continuously goes to the abdominal organ, specifically the intestine, producing further edema, but the venous return is impaired. You have reduced cardiac output, reduced flow to the other organs, and you have multi-system organ failure or dysfunction. So organ failure can occur over a wide range of recorded bladder pressures. But there's emergent indication for decompression. So number one, IAP of more than 35, or intra-abdominal hypertension with end organ dysfunction. Because if you delay, there's a 70% mortality in these patients. So your decompression could be either laparotomy or percutaneous drainage. Percutaneous drainage, if the abdominal compartment syndrome is caused by excessive fluids. But if not, if it is bowel edema, you should perform laparotomy. It could be either at the OR or the ICU, preferably in the ICU. But if the patient is hemodynamically unstable, you can just perform it at the ICU. So if your patient now has an open abdomen, so there's a recurrent abdominal compartment syndrome in some of these patients, especially if the covering on that area is not very loose. So you still should measure the bladder pressure every 4 hours. And by the way, these patients lose 500 to 2,500 ml of protein-rich abdominal effluent. So volume compensation should be done on these patients also. Um, Following resuscitation and management of specific injuries, the goal of the operative team is to close the abdomen as quickly as possible. So techniques of fascial closure of the open abdomen who could not be closed at the repeat operation include any of the following. So one is you put a mesh on the defect and suture it to the fascia. Another is you put a split thickness skin graft over that area, and the removal of the skin graft is planned 9 to 12 months after the initial surgery, with definitive repair of the hernia by component separation. Another is the vacuum assisted closure. So in these patients, this is what they do. So basically, you have these sutures in place, and progressively, it uh, it is supposed to pull the abdominal wall closer to each other. You put a silicone sheet to protect the bowel so that there will be no uh, adhesions. And then you use the same vacuum assisted closure device that was described earlier to facilitate wound healing also. So if you can see in this patient, it's almost impossible to be able to close this open abdomen, diba? So you cannot pull those edges closer together because that would result in abdominal compartment syndrome. So usually in this kinds of patient, we use this appliance. We put this silicone sheet over the abdominal contents, and these are the sutures that are left in place. It goes deep down to the fascia. So parang hinihila niya. Ayan. Hinihila niya yung fascia closer together. So usually this is performed about every 48 hours, and usually takes about 4 to 5 reoperations in order to be able to close the abdomen. So what it looks like after would be like that. So initially, ganyan yung itsura niya. Later on, maisasara mo siya, nakagaya ng ganyan. Okay? So among patients not attaining fascial closure, 20% suffer from GI complications such as intra-abdominal abscess, enteric fistula, and bowel perforation. That's why it's it's preferable for the patient to just close that open abdomen. However, here in the Philippines, what usually happens is if you have that open wound, we sometimes just allow the granulation to take over these patients kasi that vacuum assisted closure device costs hundreds of thousands for each surgery. So a lot of the patients can't afford it. That's why we just allow it to granulate and then operate the hernia at a later time. Okay. We now proceed to the special populations in trauma, specifically those pregnant, the elderly, and the pediatric age groups. So, I think itong physiology, naaral nyo na naman with OB, no? So, the pregnant patient has an increased heart rate of 10 to 15 beats per minute. Blood pressure diminishes during the first 2 trimesters and then increases again on the 3rd trimester. Intravascular volume is increased up to 8 liters, kaya they have relative anemia, delusional anemia, and relative hypervolemia. So consequently, pregnant patients can lose up to about 35% of her blood volume before exhibiting signs of shock. Okay, so For the pulmonary, you have increase in tidal volume and minute ventilation, but a decrease in functional residual capacity. Pregnant patients also have a lower esophageal sphincter that has decreased competency similar to those seen in GERD. So this increases their risk for aspiration. Liver function tests, meanwhile, tend to be increased. Even alkaline phosphatase nearly doubles. Pregnant patients also have sometimes cholecystitis because of high levels of progesterone, which impair gallbladder contractions. Plasma albumin decreases from a normal of around 4.3 grams per deciliter to an average of 3 grams per deciliter, uh, owing to the relative hypervolemia of your patients. So, renal blood flow naman increases by 30% during pregnancy and results in decrease in blood urea nitrogen and decreased creatinine. The uterus may also compress the ureters and bladder, causing hydronephrosis and hydroureter. Again, relative anemia. However, if the hemoglobin is less than 11 grams per deciliter, that is already considered abnormal. You can also expect moderate leukocytosis even up to 20,000 and relatively hypercoagulable states. So if you have a trauma patient who is pregnant, you still follow the primary and secondary survey. So the mother always receives priority, although we try to optimize the condition of the fetus, but we always choose the mother over the fetus if if we are forced to do so. So we give supplemental oxygen, we resuscitate the patient as appropriate, and then place the patient on left lateral decubitus, especially for those with very large abdomens already. So there's such a thing as focus assessment sonography in trauma. So in these patients, we do ultrasound, especially for those uh, where we have an equivocal abdomen, meaning we are unsure if there is injury. So we check the pericardial, the right and left upper quadrant, and the pelvic or the bladder. So that is for the usual adult patient. But in pregnant patients, in addition, we check the fetal heart tones, fetal movement, and sufficiency of amniotic fluid. We could also perform DPL, diagnostic peritoneal lavage. In these patients, we open up a small portion uh, below or above the umbilicus. We insert a peritoneal dialysis catheter, instill fluid, and then get that fluid back, aspirate it, and send it to the lab. If it shows that the patient has fecal material or the blood is very high inside, so the chances of abdominal injury is great, we perform exploratory laparotomy in these patients. So again, fetal heart rate is the most valuable information. So we assess it using fast ultrasound. However, after the initial fast assessment, we should hook your patient to a CTG or cardiotocographic device to measure both contraction and fetal heart tone, because changes in heart rate of the fetus is the primary response to hypoxia or hypotension. So if you have fetal heart tones of more than 160, that is already abnormal, and fetal heart tones of less than 120 usually means there's a fetal distress. So when do you perform emergency cesarean section? If you have severe maternal shock or impending death, because they say that if the fetus is delivered within 5 minutes, survival is estimated at 70%. If you have uterine injury or significant fetal distress, So the anticipated survival rate of more than 70% if fetal heart tones are present and yung age nung baby is more than 28 weeks. So if you have a pregnant trauma patient, if possible, a member of the OB team should be present during the initial evaluation of these patients. So vaginal bleeding can signal early cervical dilatation and labor, abruption of placenta and placenta previa. When your patient already has an amniotic sac rupture, it can result in prolapse of the umbilical cord with fetal compromise. Meanwhile, yung strong contractions are associated with true labor. That's why it should prompt consideration of delivery and resuscitation of the neonate already. Focused prenatal history taking should include history of the pregnancy-induced hypertension. Meron bang diabetes yung patient? Meron bang congenital heart diseases which were noted? If the patient had preterm labor or placental abnormalities. So fetal movement, you ask your patient if she remembers kailan yung quickening or when the baby first moved. And you ask if she is currently experiencing movement of the fetus. So determining fetal age is a key consideration for viability. So one of the ways that we can know the fetal age is the fundal height. Fundal height of more 20 weeks, we can also, you could see that on the level of the umbilicus. At 40 weeks, usually you can appreciate the fundal height at the costal margin. So example, if you have a 40-week pregnant patient and then she had blunt abdominal trauma, and then you see the level of the fundal height at just above the umbilicus. So there's already a discrepancy with that. You should already consider that maybe your patient had a uterine rupture. Radiation damage has three distinct phases uh, and effects on the fetus. So one is pre-implantation, the other is during organogenesis, and the other is after 16 weeks. So generally, it is accepted that safe doses of radiation from radiography are less than 5 rads. So an example would be chest X-ray, 0.07 millirads lang siya. Chest CT scan is less than 1 rad. CT scan of the abdomen is about 3.5 rads. So limit radiographs to those that are essential and to shield the pelvis with the lead apron when possible. So pwede naman tayo mag-X-ray sa mga pregnant patients, but make sure that the baby is properly shielded. So the vast majority of injuries are treated similarly whether the patient is pregnant or not. You follow standard protocols for non-operative management of blunt trauma, which avoids the risk of associated with general anesthesia. So a particular challenge is for patients with pelvic fracture because the uterine vessels are enlarged up to 60 times the normal. So if you have bleeding on those areas, it could be very strong and torrential. They say that gunshot wounds are statistically you can get up to 70% injury rate to the uterus and 35% mortality to the fetus. If the bullet traverses the uterus and the fetus is viable, CS should be performed. Stab wounds do not often penetrate the thick wall of the uterus. So if you have a patient who had minor trauma, let's say motorcycle accident, wala naman masyadong injury yung patient, probably some abrasions only, but you see the following: you have uterine irritability or contraction, you have abdominal tenderness, you have vaginal bleeding or blood pressure instability, you should admit that patient already at the minimum 24 hours for observation. So in the geriatrics naman, head trauma in these patients, the outcomes are worse in this age group, comparing it with their younger counterparts. So mortality with severe head injury more than doubles after the age of 55. And admission Glasgow score is a poor predictor of individual outcome. And there is no absolute age that predicts outcome also. So when it comes to chest trauma, one of the most common sequelae of blunt thoracic trauma is rib fractures, perhaps due to osteoporosis. Sometimes they're complicated by pulmonary contusion, noted in up to 35% of our patients, and even pneumonia. So patients who sustain more than 6 rib fractures have pulmonary morbidity rates of more than 50% and overall mortality of more than 20%. So again, chronologic age is not the best predictor. You should rather look at the injury severity score, which is the best overall predictor of patient outcome in the elderly. So you should also look at the pre-existing condition. So example, you have an 80-year-old patient who regularly joins the marathon, has no hypertension, no diabetes. Comparing that with a 55-year-old or 56-year-old patient who has diabetes for 30 years and hypertension for the same amount of time, uh, that younger patient who has pre-existing conditions has a poorer possible outcome. So age is not the best predictor. Of course, that is also a factor. When it comes to pediatric age groups naman, the most common cause of severe injury in infants and toddlers would be fall. In children, it would be bicycle mishaps. In adolescent, the motor vehicle-related injuries. So if you have a patient, pediatric patient, who cannot be intubated, uh, in children more than 11 years old, standard cricothyroidotomy can be performed. In children less than 11 years old, needle cricothyroidotomy, and also tracheostomy. So sino ba yung mga hindi pwedeng endotracheal intubation? Yung mga may severe injuries sa face, specifically sa mouth. So acute traumatic brain injury is the most common cause of death and disability in any pediatric age group. Fall is the most common mechanism of traumatic brain injury overall. For children less than 2 years old, child abuse is the most common cause of severe brain injury. For those more than 2 years old, motor vehicle collisions naman. So usually head CT scan is used to determine intracranial pathology, skull X-ray to diagnose skull fracture. So for example, you have a pediatric patient, yung nahulog, nauntog, nabagok, sabi ng mother, dinala sa'yo sa ER. Gusto niyang makita kung may bleeding kasi nagsuka yung bata and masakit yung ulo. What do you request? You don't request for the skull X-ray kasi ang makikita mo doon, fracture lang. If you want to see if there's bleeding or there's edema or injury to the brain, you request for head CT scan. However, that is a problem when it comes to your pediatric patients because if you have ever taken care of a 1 or 2 years old, they rarely lie still, di ba? Sobrang likot nila. So what we do is we sometimes even give them sedatives in order for the procedure to be done. So you choose which patient. Hindi lahat ng patient na pupunta sa ipapa-head CT scan mo. If your patient naman has a pneumothorax, which is air outside of the lungs but inside the thoracic cavity, and it is asymptomatic, wala siyang difficulty of breathing, tapos less than 15% lang, you just admit that patient for observation. Pero if that progresses, if the patient deteriorates, you need to insert a chest tube. However, kung yung pneumothorax mo is more than 15% and require positive pressure ventilation, you already decompress that. If your patient naman has hemothorax, which is blood, and the output is initially 20% of the patient's blood volume, so how do you compute that? That's 80 ml per kilo. Or nailagay mo yung chest tube, tapos persistently more than 1 to 2 milligrams per kilo yung blood loss mo dun sa CTT na naikabit, thoracotomy should be considered. For blunt abdominal injuries naman, there is such a thing as management of solid organ injuries non-operatively. Pwedeng hindi sila operahan lahat. So how do you know which patients you could perform non-operative management? So if your patient is hemodynamically stable and does not have any hollow viscous injury, 95% ang success rate ng non-operative management. However, you should know when to operate on the patient. So if your patient has clinical deterioration, hemodynamic lability, hollow viscous injury, or your patient requires more than 40 ml per kilogram of packed red blood cells, that is already indication for termination of non-operative management. So when it comes to sepsis, how do you define sepsis first? So sepsis 3 model defines sepsis as life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by a dysregulated host response to infection. So 1/3 of sepsis cases occur in the surgical population. That is why it's important. So they have come up with the surviving sepsis guidelines. So in these guidelines, patient presenting with sepsis should receive resuscitation fluids early in the course of therapy. So before you give fluids until you reach a CVP of 8 to 12. However, newer guidelines show that you should perform dynamic monitoring and physiologic responses such as heart rate, BP, and urine output should be determined. So ano ang resuscitation endpoints natin? Mean arterial pressure of more than 65, urine output of more than or equal to 0.5 ml per kilo per hour, and normalization of the serum lactate. So you should not delay because delaying it as little as 3 hours has been shown to result in worse outcomes. So you should give early empiric antibiotic therapy in your patients, and you should start that as soon as possible in the first hour and obtain appropriate cultures before starting antibiotics. So in patients who require vasopressor therapy, the first line agent should be norepinephrine. And then you could augment this with vasopressin if needed so that you will achieve that mean arterial pressure of 65 or more. So RBC transfusion natin, again, is less than 7 grams per deciliter. However, if your patient has severe coronary artery disease, ongoing blood loss, and severe hypoxemia, you should be more liberal and even transfuse even if it is just 8 or 9 or 10. So this is just a summary. So first thing, measure lactate level. Second, obtain blood cultures before giving antibiotics. However, kung madedelay yung pagbibigay ng antibiotics significantly just because of the blood culture, you give the antibiotics immediately. So you administer broad-spectrum antibiotics. You begin rapid administration of crystalloids, and then you give vasopressors or inotropes as needed to attain a mean arterial pressure of more than 65. So for the other guidelines, just memorize this table 6-10. Yan yung summary ng mga sinabi natin. Yan. Okay?